Working with people every day, we come to certain inevitable conclusions about human habits and their consequences. One thing that always seems strange, unless you think about it rather carefully, is the tendency to negativity, which is present, apparently, in most human beings. It seems much easier for us to pronounce inability than ability. And one of the commonest phrases that we hear is that I can't do it, or it's impossible, or I don't want to do it. These constant negations seem to be far more than habits. It is not simply that we really come into a rut of these kinds of thoughts and are unable to move out. There has to be something deeper behind this sense of inability in a crisis. When we start examining into people, asking them carefully about themselves, we become aware that the average person recognizes himself only as a center of power or of force or of energy. Behind all his thoughtfulness about himself is the mere fact of his own existence, the awareness that he is. Perhaps not a personal awareness, but certainly an area of awareness. This area of awareness, if it is broken down, is probably almost identical in every person. He simply possesses the sense of his own existence. Beyond this general sense of awareness, there develops a large area of specialized reactions to the fact of self. Almost immediately, we instinctively attempt to estimate what we can do on the strength of what we are. And as we pass from this general feeling that we live, that we exist, that we are, we pass out of common agreement and into a great debate, a discussion of why we are, and what we are, and who we are. And about these details, we have very little common agreement. We also have very little agreement as to how much power there is in this awareness in the center of us. Some persons accept it as very powerful, a power to affect other things, to radiate, to move out to do various labors and tasks. For others, this sense of awareness is a kind of deep pool into which things fall. The individual is essentially receptive, and he measures life in terms of how much he is hurt, or how many things oppose him, or the degrees to which this awareness is forced to accept that which it does not want to accept. So in the estimation of awareness, we come early to a polarization. And most persons are so polarized, and each individual, to some degree, is a specialized example of awareness as the power to do, or of awareness as the power to receive impulses and pressures. The individual who senses his own inner life as the power to affect others has one polarity, and the individual who recognizes his inner life merely as an area in which others can affect him has a different polarity. Generally, we must recognize these two types: those that are objective, those that plan and move out to use energy, and on the opposite polarity, those who simply are receivers of the energies of others, whether these energies be constructive or destructive. There can be no way in which we can say honestly that because we feel a certain way, others do or should. One of our great mistakes is to judge other people by ourselves, and to feel that because an attitude is natural to us, it should be natural to others. Actually, each individual's own attitudes are natural to himself, and our efforts to make him feel that his attitudes are realistic or unrealistic usually have slight result. He is aware primarily of his own feelings about things, and he lives according to them. And to him it is practically impossible to go contrary to this basic energy flow, whether it is an energy flowing from him or toward him. From the beginning of life, man has had a very great struggle. The struggle between his own awareness and his environment. It has been difficult for the human being to maintain an aggressive attitude toward the environment in which he exists. If he is aggressive, he is also defensive or belligerent. He regards the world around him as something continually conspiring against his own area of privileges. He feels that he must be perpetually on the defensive against the encroachments of life upon his right to be himself. Primitive man, of course, probably experienced this even more than we do, because he received the direct impact of the total pressure of nature. Modern man, because he has created a very strong artificial barrier between himself and nature, is not so much aware of the inevitable pressures of natural things as he is of the inevitable pressures of his own kind upon himself. Man once anciently feared nature. Modernly, man fears man. He not only fears others, but he fears himself, and doubts sometimes whether he can endure the consequences of his own actions, which appear to be uncontrollable. If in the beginning, then, the human being was subject to innumerable incidents and accidents, which made life hazardous, difficult, and disagreeable, and over these circumstances he had no adequate control, no possibility of management or direction, we can see that he had a tendency to be negative. He had a tendency to regard himself as victim, and seldom to envision himself as victor. He also realized, if he became thoughtful or philosophic in a rudimentary way at least, that he could not be the victor, that against him were amassed factors that he could not overcome. He was not strong enough to change the way of nature. He was not powerful enough to prevent the motion of the seasons or the passing of the years. He could not stop the encroachments of age upon his own body. He could not control or direct the thoughts of others. And most of all, he could not know the thoughts of others, so that he was constantly in the presence of a potential conspiracy. Once having indoctrinated his own thinking with these habits, he began to see conspiracy where it did not exist. Life became increasingly fearful, and his mental life gave him additional power to worry, to be concerned, to doubt, to have misgivings, and to estimate, at least in part, the degree of the tragedy in which he existed. One of the older philosophers once observed that no man is safe until he is dead. Now, this is a sort of hollow consolation, but it is about the only reasonable fact that some persons are able to comprehend. As long as man lives, he is capable of death. Boethius, the last of the Greek philosophers, once gave a prayer of thanks to the gods shortly before his execution by the Ostrogoth emperor of Rome. Boethius said, looking around him, that he was able to see the innumerable ways in which men died, the pain, the misery, the distress of death, that there were hundreds of ways, and he gave thanks that there was only one way in which he could die. Perhaps philosophy then, as Cicero tells us, is a doctrine to help the individual to meet the inevitable tragedies of life, including death itself. But with all this certainty moving in upon the individual, and with more and more rebellion within himself against conditions which he regarded as unreasonable or unfair, we can see how the chronic complainer became part of our folk tradition. He has always existed. But with this chronic complaining, there is wound this sense of futility, this hopelessness in the presence of things that are beyond our means to change or alleviate. If, therefore, through the course of time, man has become negative, or has been developing this tendency to regard things as perhaps more difficult than they are, we have some reason to exonerate him from an unreasonable attitude. He has many things that appear to him to be just cause for his dilemma. On the other hand, when we begin to think these problems through, we go back to the individual again. The person in the body, this field of energy within us, this thing which gives us this soft but radiant sense of self-existence, does not appear to be heavily burdened in its own nature. We do not feel ourselves as existing desperately. It is only when we move out of our own particular inner life into our environment that this desperation increases. This is perhaps the reason why so many persons try to run away from adversity. They feel that if they could leave a pattern behind, escape from a situation, walk out of a condition, that then they would achieve liberation. We have constantly associated our unhappiness with these intimate patterns that we find ourselves confronting in daily life. Habit, however, again steps in, and we find that the person who does escape, who goes away, who leaves the pattern, is usually no happier than before. He discovers that escape is not enough, because this whole world is a complex of patterns. He cannot leave a pattern for no pattern. He can only leave one pattern for another. And the new pattern in which he finds himself is seldom much improvement over the old one. This is especially true if he has already developed a dour disposition, and therefore could easily ruin a new pattern with his own reaction to it. If then there appears to be a prevailing negativity, the question we have to try to consider is whether this negativity actually originates within the energy of man, whether he is by creation a worrier, whether he is by instinct frightened, or whether he is innately pessimistic, or whether all of these pressures, or most of them at least, can be attributed to his environment. I think that the answer lies that they can be attributed largely to his environment. There seems to be nothing to cause us to assume that the simple fact of being carries with it any overwhelming pessimism. It is rather the fact that this being is unable to fulfill its own desire, and that this frustration is universal, everywhere present. This seems to be the cause of our negation or our negativity of attitude. It means, therefore, that the only solution to this problem lies in some reintegration of the relationship between the individual and his environment. Watching persons in their daily conduct, the outsider, the stranger, can nearly always see why they are unhappy. He cannot see his own unhappiness, but he can certainly observe it in others. He can realize why these persons are constantly making problems more difficult for themselves. And he observes primarily that most of these difficulties arise in what we call temperament. Temperament is the way in which we react. Temperament is apparently our available resource as far as disposition and personality are concerned. The individual with an easy temperament will certainly have an easier life. An individual who has too much internal tension will destroy happy and fortunate situations. The majority of persons in this world appear to be over-tense. They are not able to take a reasonable or relaxed attitude to the problem of daily existence. If this tension is allowed to continue, it multiplies and increases the complexity of the total social environment. Every bad disposition in the world becomes a problem for every other disposition. When we multiply this by 2.75 billion, we realize that that is the percentage of the possibility of complicating factors in our own living. We are one against 2.75 billion other persons, a large number of whom, directly or indirectly, can affect our peace of mind. This looks like a pretty heavy odds, and that there is not very much that any person can do about it. Philosophy steps in at this point and forces us to examine, not with the primitive instinct of the savage, but with the deeper understanding of the more mature and more civilized person, how we are going to justify the existing facts with other realities which we also regard as true and reasonable. We know morally and ethically that there has to be answers that rationalize and integrate our way of life. We have a moral code of one kind or another which is usually not very different from the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments of Moses. This basic code of 10 commandments, it is estimated, has already required 35 million laws to try and enforce it. It is taking 35 million laws to help us to keep 10 commandments, and we're doing poorly with the job. We almost always have to have some new laws on the average of every 3 or 4 months to take care of the infringements on the previous ones. So we become netted down in a snare of laws, all of them devised primarily to help us to get along with ourselves or each other. They are laws to curb actions or attitudes which are likely to prove commonly detrimental. Yet we are unable to enforce these codes upon ourselves or upon each other effectively. How then, in the presence of this kind of a complication, are we going to live reasonably and decently in this world where other people are constantly, apparently living unreasonably and perhaps violating the basic codes which we regard as decency? Philosophy comes in to help us to rationalize the situation. And wherever we attempt to rationalize it, we are philosophers to some degree, whether we know the word or not. One of the things we have to decide early in this conflict is the basic right of the individual. Is it true that man's happiness, peace of mind, and security must depend upon a complete renovation of the environment in which we exist? Must we dispose of earthquakes, unseasonal rains, tornadoes, cyclones, and a variety of natural phenomena in order to be secure? If we are faced with this dilemma, we know we cannot control these things. In time, perhaps, we will be able scientifically to remove these hazards. But in the process of so doing, we are going to be forced to create a science of such extraordinary power that it may become a greater hazard than the things which it seeks to overcome. Our knowledge of natural forces must become prodigious. And with such prodigious knowledge, can we depend upon our own integrity or the integrities of those around us? At the moment, it seems unlikely. We also are confronted with numerous man-made hazards, some of which appear to be almost beyond control. We know that we can, to a great degree, reduce accidents. We know that we are having greater tragedies in transportation today and on the highways of this country than could possibly be measured in the terms of the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and these other centers where these bombs have been tested or put off. We are frightened of this tremendous atomic disaster. Yet today we are killing more persons every day in quiet, peaceful, respectable ways than we have killed in war. Thus, any individual stepping out of his house must have certain hope and confidence that he will survive. This condition is not one to produce nervous relaxation, integration, peace of mind, spiritual security, and any of these things. Yet philosophy must find a way to remove the fact that man is in an incurable and uncontrollable situation. The moment the human being is unable to attain the integration of himself because of circumstances that are actually and factually uncontrollable, then the moral and ethical universe collapse. There can then be no longer any essential significance in any conviction, belief, or ideal that we possess. If man is in a situation in which there is no remedy which can be found by himself or applied by himself, he is then a pawn in the hands of fate. He is then actually unable to believe in a law of cause and effect. He is unable to find any consolation in a virtuous code. If virtue itself has no power to change the appearances of the way of life in which he lives. One school answers this situation by insisting that virtues, morality, and ethics are collective problems, that they can only be applied to masses. In other words, that nations must become good, that races must become virtuous, that great social units must become unselfish, kind, generous, far-sighted, idealistic. For it is only by these great motions that the individual can achieve security. This only sidesteps the issue, because it still leaves the problem of the individual at the mercy of collectives. The individual cannot be happy unless things over which he has no control change of themselves, or for reasons which he cannot administer with his own skill. Thus, the individual must be born, live, and die under pressures of which he is the victim. If these pressures should change and produce a greater security for him, then that security is not the product of his own effort. And again, we come into an amoral factor. The individual suffers or becomes more happy without actually involving his own character. Of course, we can say that some persons would still have to make changes in themselves, because some persons cannot be happy even in an idealistic situation. Even if the world around them was as kind and good and wise as possible, there would still be unhappy people. But broadly speaking, the whole concept that the world has to change in order to make things possible for us, this concept has to be at fault, in spite of all of the appearances that would imply that it is a legitimate concept. It has to be at fault because, if it is true, man's determinism, his individuality, his free will, are all completely subjected to accident and incident which he cannot control. If we admit this, then we admit a lawless universe. And even science is loath to do that, because it is operating constantly upon the complete acceptance of valid laws everywhere in space. This means that philosophy then turns to the individual to determine, if possible, how the individual can escape or can defend himself against the circumstances that now cause him to become intensely negative. If there is some way in which the person can meet his problem, then the moral universe is restored, and the individual is happy or unhappy according to the strength of his own efforts, according to the quality of his own endeavors. He remains the master of his soul. And unless he is master of his soul, the universe as an ethical structure has no purpose, point, or significance. Today we are almost inclined to doubt universal ethics. But this doubting, as we see it unfolding around us, is helping nothing. It is not advancing us, nor is it liberating us from anything. It is only freeing us from certain restraints in order that we may get into greater difficulty. Therefore, it cannot be solutional. The moment we assume that it is possible for the individual to live well, think clearly, and be happy in the world as it is, then we come to the analysis of a number of rather positive evidential factors to encourage this position. We observe, of course, something that most people overlook, namely that the majority of persons in this world is relatively healthy and happy. Healthy in the sense that it has the kind of health possible to its condition, and happy in the sense that the average person would rather do what he is doing than anything else. If there was ever a moment when this was not true, he would be doing something else. We are all caught in positions in which resistance becomes the greater of two ills. And we would rather cling to the evils that we have than fly to others that we know not of. We look around and we find a constant dissatisfaction. Yet in an emergency, we will all unite and defend with everything we have the right to our own peculiar kind of dissatisfaction. We find our own dissatisfaction quite satisfactory. There are moments when it is a great source of annoyance, and we are under tragic stress. But after the tragedy is past, the lesson also is forgotten. And we go on with the real fact underneath, that the average person enjoys a mixture of good and evil, so-called, of happiness and unhappiness, of pleasure and pain. But the pleasurable interludes are sufficient to justify his support of the condition he is in. If this was not true, he would rebel. And he does not rebel because essentially, when he becomes thoughtful, there are too many advantages to himself in the thing as it is. If he did not feel this way about it, then he would be very happy to gather up his effects and go to some island in the South Sea and start over. But most persons who have done that and have gone to the island into the South Sea have started back almost immediately. They find that the Shangri-La that they long for was little better than a pipe dream, and something they could not endure even after they had it. A vacation is wonderful, but a permanent one is a disaster. So man finds that the more he adjusts his thinking to the way in which he lives, the more he can find to support its factual and at least relative acceptability to him. He finds he gets along fairly well. We go to underprivileged levels of people. We go to primitive peoples. And wonderful enough, we do not find the primitive human being dissolved in tears. He is having a very good time according to his own way of life. He is quite certain that his way of life is best. And he will resent very definitely interference. This does not mean that he cannot be improved. And some wonderful and heroic persons have gone into primitive areas and brought sanitation and education and many advantages. But nearly all of these persons were first opposed, because the individual they were reaching out to help was already convinced that he had an acceptable way of life that was suitable and comfortable and convenient for him. He may have had much sickness, he may have been visited by plagues, he may have known pestilence and famine and war, his governments may have pillaged and plagued him in many ways, but still in himself he wanted to remain as he was, because to himself his way of life was acceptable. So we all live in a world of acceptable ways of life. And it is very difficult to make any reform or any progressive program effective, because the tremendous static in the individual, a static which seems to bear witness to the fact that he prefers to be as he is. Now, of course, there are certain minorities who do not feel that way. There are progressives in every group, but they constitute a small minority. Philosophy, therefore, does not advocate that anyone dissolve in tears over the miseries of mankind, because actually most persons are not as miserable as they are contented. If they were really aware that they were miserable, if they were really discontented, they would make constant changes within their own patterns, which they do not do. We might feel that it is not possible for some of them to make these changes, but great social change arises in small individual resolution, and every group can improve to some degree if it wants to. But most groups prefer to do as they are now doing. This actually reminds us that the poor can be just as happy as the rich, the illiterate just as happy as the literate, and the individual with very little certainly as contented as the individual with too much. These things are leveled off as experiences. What we have not known, we do not miss. What has never dawned upon us does not concern us. And whatever we accept as natural does not cause fear. It is the unnatural, that which we cannot accept, which causes us unusual perturbation. With some minor modifications, this picture seems to be basically approximately the way things are. I visited many primitive people whose standard of living was so low that we would regard it as unlivable. But I have found among those people just as much, if not more, personal happiness than we have. Because simple things make them happy. Simple things do not make us happy. They are just as happy with a handful of glass beads as we are with a Cadillac. They are just as happy to see their children playing around the front door of the hut, laughing themselves and talking, and the elders gathering to chat and gossip. These ways of life bring happiness to these people. Whereas if they became involved in our tense and complicated industrial and economic system, they would not only be miserable, but perhaps like the peoples of the South Sea Islands, would probably be exterminated. These things, therefore, are not related so much to world affairs as they are to individual patterns of life. If there be then these individual patterns, let us look around ourselves. We look out into a neighborhood, into an environment where we live. We observe many persons of approximately the same degree of economic security or insecurity. We know that perhaps 50 people around us are just about as much in debt as we are. That they are also paying just about as much taxes as we are paying. That their children are giving just as much trouble to them as our children are giving to us, perhaps more. That they are having a very difficult time finding a babysitter just the way we do. Yet these 50 persons, all on an approximately equal economic level, and with the same human problems in common, and part of an environment which encloses all of the great social problems which the race holds in common, these 50 persons are all different. 3 or 4 of them are outstanding optimists. Worse in debt than we are, they are having a fine time. They are just not inclined to pay or worry about it. Several are very conscientious and have the quiet satisfaction of doing the best they can. They are thoughtful, careful people, not becoming unreasonably extravagant and still clinging to the old code that you are never free until you are out of debt. These persons have regimented and organized their affairs to such a degree that they have the satisfaction of being able to meet their obligations promptly. Then there are others who, with perhaps a little more and no obligations, comparative freedom, are totally miserable. There are others that are wildly extravagant, and a few, whenever an emergency arises, simply go down to the nearest bar and try and forget it. So among the 50 people in our block, or in the block or two around us, there are many different levels of reaction to almost identical circumstances. This must lead us to the inevitable conclusion that environment is not the final equation. If environment was the final equation, we could not have such a marked difference in the reaction of the individual to the ways of life around him. So we begin to look further to find out, if we can, what lies behind these different attitudes. Why is one frugal and another a spendthrift? Why does one family run very smoothly and the next one is in constant bedlam? Here again, an analysis would indicate that numerous factors have flowed together to create the personality complexes. Some persons who had good upbringing, who were raised with principles and with solid convictions, have managed to hold on to them, and have therefore a rather orderly way of life, in which these convictions are serving as guides to conduct and are working and operating successfully. Those in bedlam may have come from families also in a state of bedlam while these children were growing up. Some have never had the internal experience of law and order. Others have never known compatibility of personal relationships. Some have never been taught responsibility. And behind the present difficulty will be found the spoiled child, the neglected child, the individual whose life pattern was warped or distorted at its beginning. We can find too much advantage or too little advantage, destroying the normal requirements of living. We find the overeducated snob. We find the person who has too much of this world's good luck, so-called. And we find that it has damaged him rather than helped him, so that even luck levels off. Too much good luck in turn becoming bad luck. All these things then tell us that actually the environments in which we live are tremendously directed and activated by our own personal conduct. That negation is almost certainly the result of the individual making weak usage or poor usage of the mental, emotional, vital faculties which are available to him in the conduct of his affairs. I do not believe that happiness or unhappiness may be regarded as primarily the result of education. Education can help the unhappy man, perhaps, to a degree, but it can also give him a splendid opportunity to rationalize his own unhappiness. After he has been well schooled, he can prove conclusively why he is miserable, which may not be of great help. On the other hand, lack of education may cause the individual to worry less and to have a greater personal sense of security. But it also threatens him with greater emergencies for which he has no foreawareness, or for which perhaps he has no adequate defense. So one or the other cannot be regarded as the cause of greater security in itself, but perhaps will assist direct this security once it has been otherwise accomplished. I do not believe that the energy in man is essentially negative, but that it passes through a conditioning personality factor, and that by this personality factor, especially through the faculty of memory, energy is strongly conditioned, and once having been so conditioned, becomes a tyrant over the life of the person. Once he has fallen under the pattern of his own thinking, once he mistakes his thinking for himself, he is going to enter into a state of slavery of some kind. Men are no longer enslaved by each other, but each one can enslave himself. He can put around his own life patterns that are so tyrannical and so unreasonable that they can destroy his liberties and his peace of mind. If it is true that the individual, rather than the situation, must be corrected, then we are in the presence of a reasonable universe, of an ethical one, of a moral one, in which policies and practices of right conduct do have their reward. You cannot work with persons over a period of time without becoming acutely aware that they can change their own ways of life. But they seldom change merely by argument, and even more seldom by rational explanation. The individual is not greatly affected toward changing any condition in his own living unless he is placed under emotional stress. He must change because he feels intensely about something. He will seldom change because it will help to make his life more reasonable. He will change only because he feels like changing. Because the impulse within himself, perhaps without rationalization at all, demands and sustains this release of energy so that he with certain enthusiasm resolves upon a new course of conduct. This is perhaps why so many lives have been strongly influenced by religion. Religion becomes an emotional pattern, inviting us to make modifications because of duty, because of moral urge, because of faith in some deity or in some universal pattern that must be obeyed. Religion giving man the sense of sublimity, the sense of his moral duty to the great invisible causes of life, will very often overwhelm his selfishness, his personal thinking, and will give him strong inducements to try to correct his own nature. We therefore observe that any individual who really, sincerely, and earnestly accepts a certain religious belief as useful or helpful will find it useful or helpful, and will observe corresponding changes in himself. Some of these changes he may not attribute to his own efforts. He may assume that these changes are of divine origin, but still the change is wrought, and with it there is almost always a marked change in environmental circumstances. When the rare thing happens, that may happen once in 100 cases, that the person does change, the evidence is consistent and irrefutable that the moment he makes an improvement in himself, his world for him also improves. There seems to be no exception to this rule. We can try to explain it in 100 ways. The individual himself nearly always under-explains it, because he is at a loss for an explanation. More likely he does not try. He simply assumes that the changes around him are fortuitous circumstances. And if he is prayerful, or if in meditation he supplicates divine help, he may assume that the persons around him are affected by this, and that perhaps God has softened their hearts in relationship to him. I happen to know a case of a man who had a very serious feud for probably a third of a lifetime with his own brother. They had not been on speaking terms for years. And this situation finally caused the elder brother so much perturbation that it led to his becoming involved in a religious group. And the one reason that he joined more than anything else was that he wanted the help of God to reconcile him with his brother. He did not feel that he could do it. He talked to me afterwards about the situation and admitted under questioning that until he had made this religious affiliation, that he had made no conscientious effort of any kind to reconcile himself with his brother for nearly 20 years. He had never written him a letter. He had never sent him a Christmas card. Never had done anything. But under the pressure of this religious organization, and under this idea, for he felt himself the aggrieved one, that he must forgive his enemy as part of a religious duty, he broke all of his previous practices and sent the alienated brother a Christmas card. At the same time, he asked the brethren of the religious group with which he had affiliated to unite in prayer with him for reconciliation with his brother. In due course, a Christmas card came from the brother with a little note attached, and in a few months the reconciliation was accomplished. The credit for this was given to the religious prayers. But I talked to the brother later, the other brother. He said, all I've waited for 20 years was just a word of some kind. Any time he had sent it, I would have met it. But I did not feel that I was the one who should apologize or make the first gesture. So actually, the credit for the change did not go to the intercession of deity, but simply to the fact that this man made a natural human effort to solve a problem. The enmity could have ended long before. In fact, there might never have been an enmity had not these persons locked themselves against facts and common sense. So much of this miserable situation that affects so many people is just as meaningless, essentially, as this particular episode. The only reason these things go on is because no one will give in. No one will change. No one will make the kindly gesture which could change the situation completely. If this be the general principle involved, and I've seen it operate hundreds of times, any change in ourselves in the direction of a greater kindliness, a greater tolerance, a greater understanding, more of the spirit of charity in our dealings, as these changes take place, we will observe a greater tendency of other people to treat us more considerately and more honorably. Now, one of the problems where this comes head on into the life of the individual is on the economic level. In this day of intense industrial and economic competition, the average person is afraid to be kind. He is afraid to be charitable. He is afraid to practice good spiritual or religious convictions in dealing with his associates or on the level of trade and merchandising. Time and again we find these situations, and they come in to talk problems over, and I have discussed both sides of these problems, both, for instance, with an employee and an employer, as to what the effect of trying to live a straight, creative, and constructive life would mean on the level of the job. And the consensus of employers is that in reality they would prefer to know that the individual who works for them has a basic strength of constructive attitude. One of them pointed out we do not feel as many think we do. Namely, that we want our salesman to cheat in our favor, because we know that in time, the man who will cheat for us will also cheat us because of his own basic concept of life. We also know that the individual who will compromise his principles will ultimately reach a situation in which he can no longer function adequately. We're going to have the alcoholic on our hands. We're going to have the unadjusted person. An individual with a negative, destructive attitude toward life is a heavy economic hazard. That is why more and more employers are concerned with the relationship between their employees and their families, their children, how much in debt they are, and all this type of thing, because the unhappy man is a loss to any business with which he is associated. He is a detriment. Also, both employer and employee pointed out something that perhaps we overlook. Namely, that there is nothing more disarming than cheerful integrity. It is the one thing you do not know what to do with. It takes a very, very corrupt person to actually attempt to deceive a person who is naturally kindly and honorable. We can deceive people and make a joyous sport out of it if we think that they are also trying to deceive us. But as the comedian W.C. Fields said many years ago, you can't cheat an honest man. Something happens. Now, honesty does not mean stupidity. It does not mean gullibility. But even in industry today, you will find that the average person who meets his industrial economic problems with cheerful honesty will seldom be worked upon with the same degree as one who is not so constituted. To cheat a person whose honor and integrity and whose natural sympathies you have enjoyed is not easy. And if that person is reasonably informed, he can protect himself. But a dishonest person, even skillfully informed, but with ulterior motive, cannot protect himself. Because he may know more, but he is more gullible to flattery. He is more likely to compromise, and in that way to come ultimately to a serious loss. So it is true that throughout our way of life, there is still a subtle reward for value. And the person who is in the greatest trouble is usually the one who has compromised his own standard of value. Also, in thinking these situations down to their roots as best we can with human nature, we must come to the realization that practically all of our trouble, difficulty, is geared to the changing patterns of our social way of life. We have many fears and doubts our ancestors never knew. They had some which we have overcome and in time practically forgotten. At this emergency period, then, it has mostly to do with the complicated situations which we have set up around ourselves. If then complication, stress, and tension go together, the need for the simplification of procedures is very great. Now, simplification is the introduction of order. And order, for the most part, is the removal of eccentric pressures from conduct. An individual under tension will not act in an orderly manner. The person moved by blind emotional stress will not weigh the consequences of his own conduct. He is so anxious to get the last word, or so determined to win the argument, that he overlooks the rules of the game and makes himself fallible to a variety of circumstances. If the person himself, moving from his own inner awareness, moves in a more or less reasonable manner, his environmental pressures will seem very much less important to him. Pressure also affects health. Intensity and negation of attitude have their physical penalties. And the individual who is sick is also much more negative. He is either rebellious or discouraged. Sickness removes most of the natural pleasure of living. And more persons are sick than realize that they are so afflicted. Sickness may simply mean a general toxic condition, a general fatigue, which results in the body being unable to revitalize itself and to adequately free itself from the broken down tissues and wastes of daily function. Wherever vitality is reduced by psychic fatigue or toxic fatigue, the person is naturally going to be inclined to fall into negative ways. Also, he can fall into negative ways because of imbalance. The overuse of a faculty, with its inevitable exhaustion, will produce negativity. Much negative thinking is really a sign of mind fatigue. The individual has thought about a subject until he can no longer think about it without irritation. Whereas if he divided his attitudes and his interests, gaining a certain compensatory balance through a variety of activities, he would not have this sense of discouragement about important things that must be done. All the way along through this same pattern, the individual must, by observation, come finally at least to this conclusion. We've all had to come to it. Namely, that we are not dealing with the problem of perfections or ultimates, but that at this stage and at this time and under these conditions, improvement of attitude certainly results in improvement of circumstances and situations. Perhaps everything will not be solved, but certainly much will be improved. This gives us every inducement to try to break through this negativity with which we are so burdened. When negativity comes into our experience, there's usually a little pattern that most persons have been through and have learned very little from it. And that is the pattern of trying very hard and watching the obstacles increase. The harder we try to force a situation, the more difficult and desperate the situation becomes. Our own aggressiveness, our own determination beyond a reasonable point creates defense mechanism in other persons. When we try to overwhelm them, they try not to be overwhelmed. And finally the situation is locked in a struggle. We try to force our will upon them. They feel that this is an infraction upon rights which are their own, so they immediately gather their will to defend their own position. Thus, if we attack, we force the other individual to defend. And if our attack appears to be unreasonable, then his defenses are apt to be very aggressive. Wherever we attempt to take privileges or assume rights that are not reasonable, we will complicate situations. Also, we can complicate situations by demanding more of life or conditions than may reasonably be expected. Some persons are never satisfied. Their demands are boundless. These persons must be unhappy, because no one can expect to have every demand met. And in the habit mechanism, the individual will become more unhappy over one demand that is not met than he will be made happy by 9 other demands that have been met. You can never completely satisfy a demanding person. And whatever he does not get, whenever he is thwarted or frustrated, the one incident is greater in his mind than all of the privileges and happiness that he has otherwise enjoyed. Demanding, then, creates resistance, just as overwhelming or forcing situations will create resistance. Another thing that gets us all into trouble is this habit of daydreaming. Now, daydreaming can be a wonderful escape into an ideal world, but daydreaming can also create within us a concept of things which cannot be achieved. And because this concept of the internal demands and requirements cannot be made real, we have a tendency to regard everything as bad that is not equal to our daydream. Daydreaming, of course, implies further pressure and tension, but it also implies too much time on our hands. And the person who has leisure to fall into himself too frequently may drown there in the end. It is very important to have ideals and try to make them come true, but to use some concept of our own to measure a situation which we cannot control is usually unfortunate. For instance, we may decide that there are certain important social reforms that must come, and we know that ultimately they will come. But if they do not come in our own time, and we cannot live in the way the world is now, we are going to be unhappy. Thus the daydream sets up an ideal state which is not to be experienced in conduct. Thus we run away from conduct and try to live in the daydream, becoming less and less socially adjusted and more critical of every factual circumstance around us. The moment we do this, we may also develop an evangelical complex. Having a certain conviction, we may try so desperately to pioneer it and evangelize it that we get ourselves into trouble. Because if we demand more of others than they can reasonably give, they will resent us. In this same way of thinking, philosophy steps in to try to help the person to become a little more positive and at the same time not more aggressive in his determinations to regulate the levels of his own satisfaction. Philosophy points out that the individual is to a very large measure capable of creating a way of life acceptable to himself. That he can do so in the majority of instances and almost any environment in which he finds himself. The philosophic equation simply being that the individual will set up in his own nature the attitudes necessary to bring about the ends that he desires. One of the most common problems we have in society today, for example, is that the average person wants more financial security than he has. Those desiring this security divide sharply into two groups: those who are willing to earn it and those who want it some other way. Now, philosophy would point out that it is perfectly possible for the average individual to improve his economic condition, especially on the level of his years of greatest earning power. It is perfectly possible for a man in position to prepare himself for improvement. If he is willing to qualify for improvement, it may well come to him. But if he remains exactly as he is and expects at the same time better circumstances, he may be disappointed. So philosophy points out very definitely that anything we want in this life we must earn. And we must earn it on its own level. We cannot become more successful as certified accountants simply because we are kind to animals or because we enjoy the fine arts. If we wish to advance with any profession, we must prepare ourselves for greater and more skillful work in that profession. If we so prepare ourselves, it is quite possible that we can advance. And the majority of persons who have actually, through adult education work or through various specialized schools, equipped themselves for something better, the majority of those persons have advanced. Because they have not only proven to themselves that they can learn, but they have also indicated to prospective employers that they are industrious and conscientious and willing to learn. So the individual who comes in to complain about business methods and business problems, which we get, who finally admits that he has been living off of his business for 20 years without putting anything more in the form of skill or knowledge or modern method into his business, that he is trying to run it as it was run in 1935 or 1940, and as expected to go on to the end of his life with security, but no thoughtfulness of his own, no effort to prepare himself for new methods and new ways, this individual does not have the right to succeed. He has only the right to what he has earned by his own effort. And economic situations by no means cover the field. Philosophy points out that in our personal lives, as in everything else, happiness, security, peace of mind, optimism have to be earned. That we have to set in motion adequate causes. And if we will set those causes in motion, we will enjoy the results. Out of 10 persons who come to ask for help, 5 or 6 have no intention in the beginning of doing anything that requires effort. If they can receive a formula, if they can be told some simple thing that can be done only with an expenditure of money, they will do it. They will pay, totally unaware of the fact that they've had to earn the money and therefore there's effort anyway. But if any problem involves self-direction, the basic changing or intensifying or sublimating of an emotional pressure, you are fortunate indeed if 1 person out of 10 will make even a moderate effort. The individual does not want to make this effort because in one way or another it is inconvenient to him. It forces him to do something that is contrary to his habitual inclination. And even if he tries, he will give up in 2 or 3 days. He does not have the rugged determination to actually change himself. This is why, in the majority of instances, we drift along from the cradle to the grave under the pressures of these negative circumstances. We really do not want to change sufficiently to go against any reasonably strong inclination which we have cultured and cultivated for a long time. For this cause, tragedy is usually the common root of self-improvement. The individual has got to see his little house of cards completely collapse before he will face himself and will recognize the need for a broad reformation of character. If this collapse finally leaves him without evasions possible, no longer any way in which he can excuse himself or blame it on someone else, if he can be forced into this predicament, he may then take stock of his own nature and do something about it. There is no reason why man has to grow by suffering, but he generally chooses to grow that way. And if that is his choice, nature must permit him to function according to the free will which he possesses. Philosophy, furthermore, on a more abstract and creative level, points out the importance of a quiet, dignified positivity. It is not necessary for the individual to prove that he is positive by being aggressive. Positivity, in most cases, is self-direction. The individual who is quietly and serenely directing his own life and has done so well in this direction that he can honestly say, and others around him will honestly confirm, that he is living a decent life and doing a good job of it, such a person has consciously or unconsciously taken on this directive power over himself. As he has taken it on, he will recognize that he is better respected, that things do come a little more easily to him, that other persons have greater faith in his integrity, and this may serve him well on a business level. If he has taken a quiet directive, so that you can say of this person that in an emergency he will follow principle. If he has achieved to this degree, he has achieved enough to escape 2/3 of the miseries of living. If he will by instinct cling to the good, he will not too seriously require help as he goes along through life. He has value. The person in great trouble is nearly always the one who cannot direct his own conduct, but must rush for help to counseling and to doctors and to lawyers and to experts in every field, simply because they cannot express themselves constructively. The person moving from this serene position within himself also makes another discovery, that this quietude, this value which he calls himself, this luminosity which is his own self-awareness in himself, has about it an absolute irresistibility if man will adjust his own consciousness. The purpose of this life-light selfness in man is constructive. It is to shine forth, to reveal, to perfect, to enlighten things. And the person who is truly expressing himself is in a fairly good way for the most part. He is not doing unpleasant things. He is moving graciously and serenely from an almost inexhaustible source of life within himself. as he moves forth out of his own nature, and his intelligence, his consciousness, his integration move through his sense perceptions, he will find that he is capable of maintaining positive and constructive attitudes. If, however, he is so negative that pressures move in and drown this positivity in himself, then he is in trouble. The great problem with the average person is to balance this force in a way in which he is not without sympathy for the circumstances around him, and at the same time is not without self-orientation. We are creatures of extremes and excesses. We are either dissolved in our sorrows, or else we are so aggressive in our joys that we escape proprieties and do things that are not constructive or valuable. To balance this requires considerable skill and thinking. Nature, building up the intellect of man over the thousands of years that have passed, has, however, also contributed a modifying, controlling mechanism. True intellect, not pseudo-intellect, but true intellect, not only increases man's knowledge, but has a tendency to decrease his egotism. True knowledge not only helps the person to know more, but helps him to appreciate more correctly what he does not know. Thus, extreme aggressiveness, belligerence, dictatorial attitudes are seldom found combined with basic intellect. The thoughtful person is not the dictator. The philosopher is not the tyrant. And the truly enlightened internal person is not the one who is making it difficult for others on the outside of living. Thus, any individual who claims to be enlightened and is at the same time dictatorial and tyrannical is not enlightened. In our own way of life, therefore, one way in which we can tell whether we are growing or not is that all real growth bestows increased enlightened patience. Growth has a tendency to cause us to understand more and more about the other person. Therefore, whereas the fool is certain that the other person is a fool, the wise man is by no means so certain that he himself is not the greater fool. The moment we condemn, it proves conclusively lack of erudition in ourselves. The measure by which we judge others reveals our basic understanding of life. Those who have greater understanding are more patient because they can appreciate that the other person is functioning from a situation which is bigger than he is, and therefore for which he does not have adequate solution. Thus we are inclined to forgive the enemy, realizing that any person who is unreasonable needs forgiveness more than censure. And actually, whether we know it or not, forgiveness is a strange kind of censure, which throws the whole weight of the other person's wrong action back upon himself, where it must ultimately belong. Whereas if we accept this wrong action and perform one like it, then we simply divide the guilt, becoming as guilty as the other person. If we are wiser than another man, we will not return his evil in kind. If we are more integrated than the other person, he cannot throw us into chaos. It is not his strength, but our weakness that is always responsible for the unhappy situation. So one of the simple proofs of growth is the ability to maintain a poise and an equilibrium under difficulty. Righteous indignation is no better and no worse than any other kind. This does not mean that we should never, under any condition, express ourselves or clarify our own attitudes. We have a perfect right to clearly indicate our position on problems. But we have only a right to explain why we do as we do. We have no right to turn this into a condemnation of someone else. Nor have we a right to assume that because we do a certain thing, that procedure must become a universal law, and all others must do it or insult us. These situations lead to trouble. We have a right to be true to every principle we hold, by strength but not by belligerence. We have a right to demand a reasonable conduct from those around us, but we have a right to show them what this is by demonstration. If then we begin to integrate our resources around our own central core, we shall discover that we are not negative. We shall also discover that most of the so-called negations that we suffer from are not really things in themselves, but are the absence of practices that should be used and followed. What we call, therefore, our negative attitude is simply the lack of a positive one. It is the lack of integration, it is the lack of that kind of internal orientation which gives the simple satisfaction and security of the individual moving from a plan and perfectly certain that he has a plan. The moment we plan living, we achieve a victory over accidents. Not only this, but it provides us with resources of an internal quality that will be very useful in such situations of a common kind that perhaps we cannot control. I would say that the average person, once having integrated himself around a purpose and with a vision of his own needs and requirements and willpower enough to practice what he knows is right, can handle about 80% of his emergencies. There will still be 20% that he cannot handle, involving personal loss, grief, accidents, perhaps war, or other things which are simply beyond the average individual's control at the moment. But this 20% of other things, will be also met with a dignity of acceptance, bringing with it a minimum of fear, worry, and doubt, and a maximum of strength, security, and order with which to face a real tragedy. If man will get rid of the tragedies that have no existence except in his own causation, he will then have greater energy and greater skill and greater insight with which to face those situations that really do tax his intelligence to the utmost. In this way, positivity can become perfectly natural to him. He has natural capacities to be positive, but he may or may not actually practice these possibilities. There is nothing that says that he has to be negative, but there is something that says that he cannot be positive without the direction of energy, and that to direct energy to its proper ends is the solution to this negative drifting in which the person becomes more and more tired, not because he is exhausting his energies, but because he isn't using them at all. And if we understand this situation, we can finally realize that man is negative as long as he does nothing, or permits circumstances to move him totally. He, however, at every moment in his life has the capacity to be positive. and he can practice by degrees the development of positivity. But when he practices it, he must practice it in the light of religion and philosophy, in order that his positivity shall not be merely belligerence. He must have wise directives, and he must use his energy creatively and virtuously. So under the direction and control of his ideals, his energies can bring him to a positive way of life. Well, time's up. I'd like to call to your attention something which I think is very nice, and we appreciate, and we know you will also. There is a restaurant across the street diagonally here called the College Grill at 4705 Santa Monica Boulevard, near the corner of Vermont, and the entrance to their parking lot is on Vermont. And a Mr. Kezos, who is the owner of this restaurant, and who has been in the location for 30 years, has offered his parking space for the use of our Sunday morning lectures. This space is a very nice and neat space and will hold about 34 cars. And he will be very happy to have us make use of it without charge until our parking lot here has been repaired. So that I think we all are grateful to him as an indication of his good-natured cooperation in our need, and to prove that people like that still do exist. You know, it's always comforting to find one in our days. Now, I'd like to also call attention to the fact that we've come to Mother's Day, and this is a day in which most people feel a deep obligation for the wonderful inspiration and the deep understanding that they have enjoyed through the years as the result of the devotion of a good mother. So we are all very happy and proud to remember and to inwardly bless that mother, living or dead, who has been so much the cause of our becoming. And in this occasion also, we are sure that everyone will want to carry a strong thought and sentiment, and young people coming along will want to also feel in themselves the dignity of their own coming parenthood and the importance of this in the building of a better world. I'd like to point out this morning that we have on the table a number of mimeograph lectures which might interest you. One is our discussion of Edward Arnold's Light of Asia. Another is our discussion lecture on the Bhagavad Gita, the great Indian classic, the Song Celestial. And still another, The Art of Outgrowing Oneself, the Quest for the Oversoul. These manuscript lectures are offered this morning. We also have on the table a number of used books, some of which we secured on our recent trip north. They're on philosophy. Here's one on Platonic concept of immortality. Here is one, nerves and common sense. That ought to be very interesting. Of course, most of us aren't nervous at all, but we might become so under some situation, and you might as well be prepared. We also have a number of the novels of Marie Curie. Most of these are out of print, and a great many of them are very interesting along philosophical, mystical lines, such as we have The Life Everlasting, and one of her most famous works, The Romance of Two Worlds. Her Adath is outstanding, I think, and The Master Christian, Thelma, and several others. So we hope you will visit our book table and help us along through purchasing our books, which will give us means of continuing our work. Next Sunday morning's subject is an esoteric interpretation of the third eye. There have been some books on that subject recently. Some of them are interesting and some not quite so good. But anyway, next Sunday morning we're going to discuss this mysterious eye in man, which is the center of his contact with value. The possibility of the individual seeing internally on a level above that of his external sensory perceptions. We think this is an interesting subject. We hope you'll all be with us for that occasion. And we thank you very much.